Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the March 2021 edition of our monthly webinar series. My name is Chris Pankowich. I'm the Research and Knowledge Lead here at the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health. I'm very excited and appreciative for the efforts that have gone into turning this particular webinar into a reality. Back in December, we held a webinar on the topic of supporting faculty and staff to create a healthy and engaging learning environment. Much of that conversation focused on some high-level concepts and ideals that can be embraced in this mission. And ever since then, our community has been asking for more tangible examples of how this can be done, and ideally, how other campuses are actively implementing some of these concepts. Thankfully, our colleagues from the University of Saskatchewan heard our call to action and are willing to share their journey to date. Through this webinar, we will see how they have been working towards an integrative approach involving input from student services, teaching and learning, and faculty champions. With that being said, I will now take a moment to share a brief land acknowledgement. We are all viewing and participating in this webinar on traditional territories of Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. Our special guests for today will be sharing their knowledge and learnings while on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We want to recognize their contributions to this place and express our gratitude for our ability to come together and learn today. Before getting to meet our guests, I do have a few housekeeping notes. We will be fielding audience questions at the end of this webinar. I would like to draw your attention to the bottom of your screens where you will see a Q&A feature and a chat feature. Please use the Q&A to submit questions for the panelists, which I will then read out at the end of the webinar. We will try to get to as many of these questions as possible. For all other inquiries or comments, please use the chat feature. We encourage you to use this function to connect with each other and share your thoughts and perspectives as the webinar is occurring. I'll be taking a bit of a backseat on this one, so I'll be happy to participate and join all of you in the chat. Finally, a brief follow-up survey will be sent to all of you via email after the session, and it will be greatly appreciated if you can fill that out. With that being said, I will pass it along to our special guests, and I'll pass it to Peter to take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. And we really appreciate the invitation to share with you today some work that we've been doing now for around about 3.5 years. You're going to hear from my colleagues, Nancy Turner and Murray Drew, shortly, but I'm just going to kick us off and talk about what our aims are for today in terms of the outcomes. So our goal is to ensure that everybody who's with us by the end of the session is able to identify the key ways in which the practices we're talking about can actually influence the mental well-being of students and indeed the entire campus community. And then to be able to describe those teaching and learning practices that actually enable well-being, and to be able to identify at least one of the practices that's related action that could be taken to improve mental well-being of students and indeed by association the entire campus community. So we'll revisit those at the end of the session. So around about 4 years ago, I was talking to one of our university faith leaders, and he said to me, "What in the world is going on with student mental health?" And the phrasing was really interesting to me, the what in the world, and it made me think about the question a slightly different way. And he actually asked me to come and talk. He was part of the one of the Rotary clubs here in Saskatoon. And so I found myself talking to a room of seniors about this question. And I thought about it in these terms around the world and wider society, around then the influence on the post-secondary environment, and then the influence on our students. And when I thought about it in these ways, it was an interesting question over the course of time, particularly given who I was talking to. And so I went back to this notion of what did things look like around about 50 years ago. And so this is the College of Commerce, now the Edwards Business School at the University of Saskatchewan, the graduates, and from 1970. And just in case you were wondering, there are 3 female graduates. So that is just under 2% of the graduating class are female. So immediately that tells us something. There was an amazing leap to 4.5% the following year. But just to say where we are today, that actually our student body, and this is 2018, the Student Society, just a sense of how different things look today and who is on our campuses, and that being such a critical element. And I'm also told by my colleagues at the Edwards Business School that business is apparently a little bit different than it was 50 years ago as well. So as a starting point, even with that notion, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I'm going to show you a lot of pieces here, but the wider world is so different in so many ways around globalization, population, the notion of scarcity, increased competition, instability, uncertainty. Not that we never had these things before, of course we did, but it's just the volume of it, technology, obviously the changes in society, how we live, and the obvious COVID. And so the changes to our environment that we need to reflect, we find ourselves with larger campus populations, sometimes feels much more impersonal, competitive. The increased diversity is a really good thing, just as we were seeing, but there's a lot of work involved in actually that piece around inclusion and reflecting and supporting an increasingly diverse community. And then other shifts that have been positive towards mental health around reduction of stigma, but it means more students seek services, which means we've actually invested in services. But as we know, there are limits. But a lot of this sort of takes us to this question that we keep talking about: mental health issues, disorders, the question of neurodiversity, but particularly around anxiety, depression, and suicidality. And for me and the work that me and my teams do, there's actually a much bigger picture to this, and I'm not going to go into all of these. I'm going to take it as read that if you're here today with this interest, to say, you know, that all of these different elements are going on. So when we talk about mental health, in a way, it's almost a byword for all of these other things that we're aware of in our environment and the complexity of it. So in 2017, we launched a wellness strategy at the University of Saskatchewan. This is our framework around these three key elements, sort of interdependent elements in these different areas, 13 different dimensions of wellness. And the framing that was needed to change for us a lot was this promotion, prevention, intervention. We're doing a lot of work in the intervention space, so reactive interventionist. We needed to shift some of the thinking towards the prevention, and even better, the promotion. And so this was a sort of key point for us, and my colleague Nancy Turner was involved with this work. And actually, I was just realizing I actually met my colleague Murray Drew, who's with us today, on the day we launched the wellness strategy. So there's this interesting kind of circularity to us doing this work. And so our thinking around this was really these three key pieces around how we could promote wellness in an upstream way. So language that's been used a lot, certainly not my word, as well as to identify and support at midstream in a more preventative way, so that we weren't just being reactive and waiting for crisis downstream before we intervened, which is a lot of what we'd seen in the past and goes on today. You know, many institutions are not as fortunate as the University of Saskatchewan with some of the resources we have. But again, with resources comes responsibility and an increased need. And so the question was, if we changed what happened upstream, wouldn't that change what came downstream? And so with that thinking in mind, our approach was having a wellness strategy for the whole campus community. And then as well, obviously having the wellness, accessibility, community building supports for the entire community, but also for specific groups within that community as well. Making sure that we were building in the wellness and harm prevention, harm reduction, educational programming, the likes of mental health first aid and safe talk, bring in the bystander, all those kind of pieces. But I still had a question myself that we were probably missing something in order to be genuinely promotional and upstream. And so around the time that we launched the wellness strategy, there was also a revised version of the University of Saskatchewan Learning Charter. And I know that we are one of very few institutions, I believe, in Canada that has such a thing. And it was a very useful tool to put alongside it. And so staying with the river analogy, it felt like two pieces were coming together at the same time, which actually could then have this sort of confluence effect as they came together to have a slightly changed approach and changed future of what that looked like. So I talked to my colleague Nancy Turner and Chad London, one of our deans, the Dean of Kinesiology at the University of Saskatchewan. And I said that we actually need to get into the classroom, or as it is at the moment, the virtual classroom, because otherwise I'm not sure all of our best efforts will change very much. So we started a project through TLARC, which is our Teaching and Learning Advisory Resource Committee that works to look at all the teaching and learning pieces. We felt it was critical that it was actually driven from a respected and understood place, but also critical that we weren't doing this in a top-down way, that it was very much focused on the faculty experience. So the three strands, our colleague Rose Roberts, who isn't with us today, led talking to students about their perspectives. Murray led talking to instructors about their practices. So this wasn't necessarily looking to reinvent the wheel, it was looking at what people were already doing. And then Nancy and I talked to leaders and service providers about their perspectives. And with the goal of making a case for change, but also a toolkit for change, making it practical. So this continues to be a work in progress. And so our title for today came from this this process and this quote that came up. And I remember reading it in some of the notes, and I thought, which strand does that come from? So someone saying, understand that we're human too. And it occurred to me, and it was our discussion, that it could have come from any of those strands. Now, in the end, it actually did come from a student, but it made us realize that as we talked about a whole campus approach, which is what our wellness strategy was, that different people were having very different experiences. And part of the difficulty was actually being vulnerable, being able to share what our experience was. One of the things that was clear very quickly was looking at the health and wellness piece, it had to be balanced with this academic standards piece. So that's where some of the criticism would be if we didn't have our mind on standards. So we were very aware of that, but we were, as I said, we were also very aware that it couldn't be handed down. It had to be sort of a grassroots approach. So that balance had to be there. And the research that we were looking at absolutely indicated to us that academic success and student mental health link. So that was clear to us from the outset. But one of the other things that we did know was that student wellness obviously supports student retention and academic success. But one of the key questions we were posing to ourselves was whether the organization and delivery of academic programs actually supported student wellness. So that was a big question mark. But some of what we were hearing, and I'll read the quotes today just so you get them direct. But a student told us, being a student has made it much more difficult to manage my mental health. The demands of the program often require sacrificing self-care time, which can be hard to handle. So this question that wellness and positive mental health and academic success were mutually exclusive concepts was clear from the outset from a lot of what we heard. So that led us to adding this element with this project that was going to look at teaching and learning practices that supported wellness or student mental health. And the difference between the left-hand side, which is to say the mental health first aid, the safe talk, they are about mental health. And the idea of the teaching and learning practices, they are for mental health. And so with this extra for mental health piece felt like the upstream piece to us that we really needed. And a lot of the framing for us was also around talking about resources students had versus the stresses that students have and being aware of them. Also recognizing that some of the resources that we give students actually feel like stresses and they add to the load rather than remove it, if that makes sense. So we wanted students to feel that they knew where they could get help, and that they knew that it was challenging, but they knew what to do versus feeling really demoralized. And so we came up with 4 key questions through this work. Why do I need to know, or sorry, what do I need to know and do? Do I belong? Why does this matter to me? And can I succeed? And that really distilled everything that we were looking at. And really, when we break them down, I'm just going to give you some examples of what I mean and what we heard. So a student told us, I don't think the course load needs to be as heavy as it is. I get that you want us to be the master of everything or whatever, but that's not reasonable. There's just so many other little things that are attached, which just amplifies the stress and definitely decreases your mental health. And we heard that a few times. And so the main stresses that we heard about were the expectations weren't always clear, that there was often too much in the curriculum. So it was the nice to haves rather than the essential pieces that were focused on learning outcomes. And then the structure, the coherence wasn't always working in terms of sequencing of topics, which often meant that it was assumed that they had knowledge that they hadn't actually been taught or practiced yet. And even in year 1, some of the blame went back to high schools not teaching people things. And again, I think some of that was a generational piece. Around the do I belong, we heard things like in first year, I was like, Am I even good enough for university? Can I even do this? And that was even more true of students from non-traditional backgrounds, first-generation students. And so the main stresses there were a lot of people were experiencing higher education as quite an impersonal experience. And they felt that they weren't necessarily able to connect or see themselves in the environment. And in a lot of cases, quite clearly, the environment wasn't designed with students like that in mind. And going back to 1970, much of our approach hasn't shifted dramatically in that 50-year period, and yet the student population has. And so there was this sense of anonymity, even exclusion, but also students flagging that some of the delivery or feedback style was unintentionally harmful, or in some cases intentionally harmful, a kind of rites of passage that actually you have to earn it. And if you don't suffer and struggle, you don't earn it. Why does this matter to me? Students talked about, if regurgitation is what is required on my first midterm, then I'm just going to memorize everything. But what am I getting from this class? Nothing. It's just wasting time, honestly. And I'm at the tail end of my degree, and I just did a whole term of electives. It just feels like a bit of a cash grab to me. I suspect some of these things will be familiar. And so students were telling us that they just felt a bit disconnected in that way with the content. And it wasn't necessarily relevant towards their goals, why they were doing certain things, where the work would take them. And the other thing that became quite clear is that students were, because of the model, they were being focused much more on external rewards, or particularly good grades, the expectations of the institution, even family expectations, and much less by intrinsic factors like curiosity and the desire to learn, develop their skills. And I think a lot of this also comes from the notion of that competition and the individualism versus the group approach, the community approach. And the final question was, can I succeed? And we heard, it's like so much of the rest of my life depends on what happens on a class by class basis, like one mark, one evaluation, one course. It feels like it has a huge stamp on my future. And it feels like that step-by-step anxiety is promoted a lot through the way our academics are organized and discussed. And so we were hearing that students felt that there were unclear or even arbitrary rules of the game, and actually that constructive, timely feedback wasn't always provided. Students didn't necessarily, therefore, know what good looked like, or if it wasn't good, how they might make it good. And so there was a sense that students didn't have enough control or flexibility in the learning approach, which I know has been a big part of our conversation in recent months. So where we found ourselves was these three elements of, I don't know how, I don't belong, I just don't care, and I can't succeed. And these we were seeing from perfectly capable, motivated students. But this was a new picture. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Nancy Turner, to take it from here.
That's great, Peter. Thank you so much. I think that's a great kind of context setting for us. And just to kind of put my section in a bit of context, I'm the Director of Teaching and Learning Enhancement at the University of Saskatchewan. And so I oversee groups like our Teaching and Learning Center and a few others who support teaching and learning development and curriculum development. So that's kind of the lens. And that's where the connection that Peter had mentioned was just, I think, so helpful in terms of thinking from the student mental health and student service side and the teaching and learning side. So drawing on the evidence that Peter has kind of foregrounded in terms of the project that we were working on, but also drawing extensively on the literature. There wasn't a ton of literature in this area. I know Murray did a huge amount of reading to look at what there was in terms of evidence of connections between teaching and learning practice and student mental health. But where there was some work that had been done, we were able to draw on it. There's some great work from about 5 years ago, for example, from Australia that we drew on heavily. And of course, we had a broad kind of understanding of psychological theories. I've seen some of those referenced in the chat, and good teaching and learning practices more broadly. So we drew on all of those, and we looked at how could we create environments that would mitigate stressors and foster resources of students. So as Peter said, our students come to us with stressors, they come to us with resources. Our learning environments can either, in the ways Peter's described, add to or amplify those stressors or drain resources. Or our learning environments can mitigate those stressors and foster an individual's resources. And we were really looking at how do we get to that latter point through these 4 elements of teaching and learning practice: designing, instructing, assessing, and relating. And so that's the frame that we used as we moved into consideration. So I'm going to move through each of those in turn. So starting with design, few kind of key points here. In terms of design, we're speaking here about the plan we have for the learning experience of our students and all of the elements within it. So this is broadly speaking the curriculum. Things that are really impactful here that we know are really impactful are things like streamlining content. And again, Peter's comments and what we heard from students certainly spoke to this very directly. Really looking at what is needed in the course, what is essential, and streamlining down to that essential content is really important. It's really easy, as anybody who's ever designed a course, and I'm sure many on the call have, it's really easy to add more things, especially when you're really passionate about the subject area and you have so much that you want to actually share with students. But cognitive overload is real, and there's only so much that the human brain can actually take in and process in any given period of time. And we need to be really mindful of that, because sometimes the extra things that we add can actually undermine the learning of students for those essential things. And so kind of trying to cut away and really get to that, that really essential is quite important. And interestingly, this is something that I saw a great opportunity for us to do as we moved to remote teaching last spring with the onset of the lockdown and the pandemic. It really forced us all to, as we recreated courses, consider what was actually essential. Kind of think of it like tidying up. We were moving house. We were going from our typical face-to-face that we were all very comfortable with and moving into that online context. And we were trying to tidy up curricula as we did so, because everything we picked up to move, we had to look at almost in a Maria Kondo kind of way, tidying up the curriculum. You know, does this actually spark the essential learning outcomes that are needed in the course? And through that process, a lot of faculty were able to actually set aside things that didn't actually contribute to those essential learning outcomes. So that's the first one. Next one, in terms of purposeful organization and sequencing of curriculum, I think is important because, of course, ideas build upon each other. A learning experience is not just an individual course, it is a system of courses that are put together in very deliberate ways, or we hope put together in very deliberate ways. Ideas build on each other, concepts connect, basic skills need to be built to more complex skills as a student goes through a learning experience. And for each stage of those, we need to be really mindful that there's enough time built in there for practice and for feedback, because that's the essence of learning for a student. And so sometimes, back to the first point, if we overload the curriculum, we lose that time for that practice and feedback as well, and don't have that in our organization and sequencing. So that's another really important one. The third one, constructive alignment, probably a term that many of you have heard. But basically, the teaching and learning practice, if it's learning centered, it needs to really start with a set of outcomes that the student will be able to do by the end of the course. And then the course will have activities that allow the student to learn and to eventually be able to do these things. And then ultimately, it's going to have ways in which the student practices, gets feedback, and importantly, of course, demonstrates whether they've achieved those outcomes. So you'll see here on the left, kind of that constructive alignment where you've got those outcomes, the activities, and the assessment all connecting together very deliberately. So with the outcomes, what will a student be able to do by the end of this learning experience? The activities, what activities will help them actually learn these things that I've set out and intend to help support them to learn? And then the third one with assessment, how are they going to practice, get feedback, and demonstrate those outcomes? I just want to further describe this by contrasting it with a non-aligned course, and maybe something that we've experienced on the right, where you start with the content and you end with assignments and exams that are designed to help determine whether the students knows that content, or at least hopefully they're designed that way. In contrast here with the content, we're asking, what will I cover? And in the assignment and exams, we're asking, how am I going to determine if the student knows this? And if you just see the difference between those questions, on the right, we've got questions that are about the teacher and what the teacher does, not about the student. And on the left, we're very much looking at how this experience is supporting the students in their learning. So that's constructive alignment, again, very important in terms of supporting learning. Yeah, you can go on sorry, I think you missed a slide there, Peter. So we have then a few more points, thanks, on designing. So focusing on outcomes that matter as part of longer term learning, I think is really important. So learning that's done in courses connects to and builds on program level learning outcomes and the skills that they need post-graduation. Making explicit what's expected of students and why it matters. And again, here, just to touch on the fact that students not only need to hear it, so it's not just about saying it in a class, but it's actually having them hear it several times, maybe in different ways, to see examples of it, to discuss it, to actually engage with these ideas and concepts, perhaps even trying things out with low stakes. And then also considering how it connects to the longer term kind of program and life outcomes and what ultimately matters to them. And you'll see an echo here in terms of the points that Peter made earlier, where students feel more stressed. And then finally, designing for optimal student challenge. And again, this is not an easy one, especially as we have varied student populations, but we design for our typical and again, that diverse kind of student group in mind. And this is also something that over time we refine as we see how students experience learning, see how they do on assessments and demonstrate their learning, see gaps, see opportunities where we need to make shifts in curricula. So it's very much an iterative process to get that optimal student challenge, and something we're probably seeking on an ongoing basis and also needing to adjust every time a new group of students comes into our class. So a quick example of good practice here is a wonderful colleague, Lynn Weber. She basically teaches a vet pathology class, incredibly content heavy course in an incredibly content heavy program. I think that's the way we've described it in terms of content heavy. And what Lynn does is she takes steps in her course design to ensure that students are connecting concepts from her course to other ideas that they've experienced, and that they are actually seeing a sequence and a building of those ideas over time. She also has outcomes that are very much focused on student skill development, and as a result of that, she has learning strategies. She's designs in learning strategies that are very much about hands-on learning and hands-on work. So just a quick example of a wonderful colleague who's doing this work very much in our context. So next is instructing. Again, this is really about what the student does, not what the teacher does. So how do we challenge that idea that if we sit people down and sit students down and tell them things that they're going to come to know somehow through that experience? And I mean, even more of a stretch, they're going to be able to do the thing just by having heard about it. So again, here with instruction, we're very much thinking about that active and engaging kind of process for students, where instead of just receiving content and ideas and often going away and learning it on their own, we're actually designing experiences where students engage with content and ideas and make sense of it in the classroom or the learning environment, and that we actually facilitate those opportunities and create them very intentionally. So these practices not only connect to an opportunity for deeper student learning, but of course they're also connected to ideas of and perceptions of belonging, and help to motivate students and help again to address some of those concerns that Peter brought up at the beginning. So an example of good practice here comes from another wonderful colleague in political studies, Colleen Bell. And Colleen is working in political studies with some fairly challenging concepts in looking at the political world and political systems. And sometimes I think it's easy when examining those things to feel like we're helpless in a world wrought with conflict. And you know, the students who are kind of diving into this as an area of study certainly would feel that way. And so Colleen's very intentional approach is to help students find their agency and to develop skills that will help them to actually navigate that very complex world. And she uses a project, an inquiry project-based approach, where she's helping students to gain skills in questioning and investigating, and then sharing learning with peers and with others within the department, so that she can help develop those skills, but also in doing so help students see their agency in finding solutions and actually acting in this world to make a difference. And so it very much, her instructional strategy here very much matches that outcome of what she's trying to achieve for students. Okay, moving on to the fourth one, which is relating. Again, this is maybe a bit more self-explanatory, but often it's a little bit less easy to achieve. I think creating a learning environment that's inclusive and respectful takes a lot of skill and a lot of practice. But again, we can't actually develop that ability if we don't go in with the intention to create those kind of environments. So really here, what we're trying to do is create a secure environment for students, one where they feel safe and where they feel cared for, not only by the instructor, but also by their peers. And so having those opportunities to connect to each other and to the faculty member. And as importantly, I'd say, connect to the subject, connect to the content, and see that relevance of what they're learning and the skills that they're developing to the things that matter most to them. So Colleen's example was, certainly speaks to relating as much as it does to instructional practices. That idea that the work that they're doing is going to help them do the things that they want to do and to achieve, and can help them connect those things to things that matter most to them. And we're going to hear a little bit more about another wonderful, one of the best examples, in fact, I've seen of doing this from Murray, as he gets a little bit more in depth in terms of some of the approaches he takes in his classes. So you'll hear more on that later. The last area that I want to touch on is assessing. And I think this is likely one of our most significant areas, and where I think we have the opportunity to have the strongest impact on student learning. It's where we certainly heard the loudest and most frequent voices from students in terms of the impact that assessment had on their well-being, from feelings very much of stress, of being overwhelmed, of having a lack of clarity, extreme worry, and a sense of extreme pressure. This was very much an area that we heard loud and clear. So we can certainly do a huge amount by changing our assessment practices to address some of those concerns and those experiences students are having. Low or no stakes assessment as part of a learning process with constructive feedback built in as part of it. This certainly helps with learning, but it also helps them come to understand the rules of the game. So, Peter made mention that lack of clarity of like, what do I even do? How can I even succeed here? By having smaller, less kind of significant assessments along the way where they get a chance to try it out. And if they fail, there's less of a severe consequence, and with feedback, they can actually see where they went wrong and start to actually see a potential pathway through to success. So really, really important in terms of the overall shift in assessment practice. It can take more time, but we know that it diminishes student stress and it actually helps them achieve hugely. And again, depending on how we design it, if we do it mindfully, it doesn't necessarily have to take more time either. We also want to provide flexibility and choice in the ways that students demonstrate their outcomes. Again, this can help with motivation, but it also gives students more of a sense of agency in an experience that sometimes in university learning, they feel like they have very little control. And so giving them those options where we know that all of these different assessment options will allow them to demonstrate their learning. Why would we not want to give them some choice so that they could select the one that they feel allows them to show their best kind of demonstrate their learning to the best effect. I think giving them some of that control where it's possible to do so is hugely helpful in terms of them feeling that sense of control and like they can see an opportunity to succeed through that selection. Creating clarity around expectations. Also, I've touched on this previously. It's not just about telling them about expectations, but it's allowing them to actually have conversations about it, see examples, try things out, and build an understanding of expectations through a process of experience, not just hearing. And the last one, which I'm not going to get into hugely, is competency-based approaches. It's a very complex topic, but really competency-based assessment is fundamentally about more authentic assessment, where we actually have assessment that matches the thing that we're trying to actually, the outcome that we're actually trying to have the students demonstrate, and that hopefully that outcome is very aligned to the thing that they're going to have to do either in the next step of their program or something that would apply more in their world outside of higher education learning. So I think that that one is a very important thing that we can look at. Usually in competency-based approaches as well, we have students learning over time. And so again, having more opportunity to demonstrate learning repeatedly and coming back and having an opportunity to have a second go at demonstrating learning on a particular competency. Good example here from our colleague Sandy Bonney, who works with in our Indigenous Student Achievement Pathways. Again, these are students who often bring very rich life experiences and a depth of knowledge that's not that common in first year, but they haven't necessarily had the opportunity. Their K-12 preparation has been kind of non-standard, and so they have missed the opportunity to build mathematical literacy and often to develop the academic vocabulary that would normally be gained in an urban kind of high school context. And so Sandy very intentionally builds up a process of assessment where she starts with them drawing on kind of a provided vocabulary in her first midterm, and then in the second midterm, the students actually collaboratively build the vocabulary, and then they go into the assessment and utilize that. And she gives additional kind of feedback around use of that academic disciplinary vocabulary. And it's very much aligned with Sandy's outcome of helping these students develop skills for studying and succeeding in science. So those are the 4 areas that I wanted to touch on. And if we practice these in evidence-informed ways, we can ultimately, if you want to go to the next one, oh, I've got them in the wrong order here. We can ultimately help students get to the point where they are actually knowing where they belong and where they can succeed and where they feel that they care. So we're moving them from not knowing and doing, from feeling they don't belong, from feeling that they just don't care and that they can't succeed, to this kind of a scenario, bolstering those resources and trying to mitigate those stressors. I also wanted to just provide a little bit of context here in terms of teaching and learning practice. I've talked a lot in thinking about these 4 areas on the instructor-student relationship and what happens in that very kind of intense learning experience in classrooms, virtual or otherwise. I also just wanted to note that it's important to note that instructors can't achieve these things and can't actually implement all of these varying kind of evidence-informed ideas around teaching and learning practice if the environment that they're in doesn't support them in doing so. So there's more than just the instructor and student. We need to look at the department and we need to look at the institution and how we're creating those environments that enable these kinds of practices for instructors and also remove barriers to them moving in this way. So thinking about collaborative program design, thinking about our reward structures within institutions, thinking about providing resources where we can to enable these things, thinking about even having learning spaces in classrooms where this type of teaching is possible, having systems like our learning management system or assessment software that actually, again, allows for this type of assessment to take place in a more efficient way. And also providing professional development supports, of course, not only for individual faculty, but as we find within the US, and again, supported in the literature, working with teams of faculty in collaboratively developing their teaching practice can have a huge impact to helping us move towards these 4 kind of evidence-informed teaching practice areas. So I'm now going to pass over to Murray to answer the question in a little bit more depth about how you teach to accomplish these things and give a really in-depth example of what he does in his class that really aligns with what we've been talking about to date. So over to you, Murray.
Thanks, Nancy. And I did remember to unmute myself. I spent most of the last year being muted and being told that I need to turn it on. So I have a bunch of pictures, and I know they look really hazy, but if I haven't got permission from everybody to be on there, I kind of zoned it out. If you do see a picture that's in focus, it's because I have permission. So I wanted to start by saying that this is some of the stuff I've done in the last 3 years, thinking about teaching methods that can support student mental health in the classroom. But a lot of instructors do these kinds of things, and I think what I'm doing here is essentially just good teaching. But when I ask other instructors, what do you do to support student mental health in the classroom? They'll say, well, I do nothing. But then if you ask them what kind of teaching methods they use, they're exactly the things that do support student mental health. I think the thing that's missing is that intentionality and realizing that I am doing these things specifically to support mental health. And I guess that's where I began. So that's just a bit different. So this is a picture of my class on the first day of classes. I usually do this every year. And because it's blurry, you can't tell, but this is 95% women. I think there's 4 guys in that class. So this is the opposite of the class that Peter showed. Not only that, this is, I teach in the Department of Animal and Poultry Science. So these students are all pre-veterinarians. So they want to become veterinarians. And in that class of 90, probably 5, maybe 10 will become veterinarians. So this is a recipe for heartbreak and a lot of problems, because a lot of them are going to find out in the first year that there's no way they're going to get into veterinary medicine. And that can bring on anxiety, depression, all sorts of things. So I had, that's what I'm starting with. Can I go to the next? So one of the things that we've talked about that really helps student mental health is that feeling of belonging and creating a bond between the instructor, myself, and between the students. So these students don't know each other. When they come into a class the first time, I don't know if you remember what it was like. You're the last person in class and you have to go to a seat in the middle of a class of 200 people. That's pretty daunting. So it's a lot easier if students know who they are before they get here. So one of the wasted opportunities we have is the summer before students arrive. So this is a first-year class. These students have maybe never been on the campus. So I send out this email in the beginning of August describing who I am, and I put a picture of myself with an animal, and I ask them to do the same, send it back to me with some information about themselves. And I ask a question is, what could I do in class to support your, to make you successful? And usually I get back about 2/3 of the class usually sends me something back. These pictures here, the 3 instructors for the course, Dr. Hogan and Dr. Brook teach probably about 1/6 of the course each. These are the TAs for the lab, so they can see who they're going to be dealing with once they get here. Next one. And this is the kind of thing I'll get back. So this is, I've asked Lindsay whether I can use her picture. So Lindsay is a farm wife with 5 kids. So she's been away from university for a fairly long time. She wants to become a veterinarian and so has gone back to university. So she's going to have special needs that I now know about that other students don't have. I also hear from students that I have ADHD or I have a learning disability. And so knowing that, first of all, it makes me understand them better, and it allows me to maybe teach to them a slightly different way. So this is what it looks like when I get all those pictures back. And I make this available to all the students so they can go online and they can read about who their fellow classmates are. Next one. The other thing I do is once these students get to class, then I want to continue this kind of building of relationships. So I always try to explain to them who I am, so keep that going. But what I really want to do is have them get to know each other. And so Fiek was a student from the Netherlands who was in my class one year, and I asked her if she would come down and ask or tell them about exchange opportunities for students to go to the Netherlands. If I find a student has an interesting experience, then what I will try and do is have them come down, ask them if they want to talk to the class. Some don't want to talk because it builds anxiety, but some will go down to the front of the class and talk about something that they've been involved in. So I think that that helps build these relationships. I have activities in class which also kind of make students kind of relate to each other. So this is an in-class debate I have. I assign students to groups of 3 and they debate an issue regarding animal production. And they have to argue both sides of the question, for and against. This is the worst possible setup to have a debate in class, but we kind of manage it. So this is another way that students get to know each other and listen to a diversity of different opinions. Okay, the next thing is that, does this matter to me? I think sometimes students feel that we just give them stuff to learn because it's random and there's no real reason for them to be learning this. So again, 90% female, 90% want to be veterinarians, and they have an idea that I'm at the University of Saskatchewan because I need to get 80% in every class. And if you make the class hard, you're making my life hard. So I want to get through to them the idea that what they're learning is important. A lot of the kids are from cities and now they're in an agriculture college and we're going to teach them about cattle, pigs, and chickens. And they think, what has this got to do with what I want my life to be? First thing I do is have the associate dean academic from the vet college come over and talk to the class. And he tells them that there's no such thing as a cat vet or a dog vet. There's only vets and they have to deal with all the animals. And that while they're at the University of Saskatchewan, they should take advantage of all of the opportunities to learn about all of the species of animals. So he tells them that, you know, learning about agriculture is not a waste of time. I also talk about careers that they can get into that are non-veterinary careers, because let's face it, 90% of them are not going to be vets. So I have recent graduates put together videos about what their jobs are and what kinds of things from their undergraduate were important to them in those jobs. So I make sure that they know that everything that I'm teaching is going to be useful after they graduate, no matter what career they have. I also explain how to be successful in the course, because I think a lot of times it's really random. We give them a syllabus and it says, these are the assignments and this is how much they're worth, but we don't really tell them what we're expecting. So we might assign a writing assignment and they have no idea what they're doing. So what I try and do is I give them examples of the assignments I'm going to give. I show them how I mark it with a rubric, and I show exactly what I'm looking for. I also am doing something that really probably most people can't do, but usually I allow students to hand in an assignment, provide feedback, and give it back to them. And then I allow them to rewrite it, improve it, and then hand it back in for remarking. Now, to me, the only way you can learn how to write is to learn how to rewrite. I never learned to write as an undergraduate because I never had to rewrite. It's only when I became a graduate student and they forced me to do it a second time that I became better. So I try and provide them with feedback that's meaningful and allows them to improve. I also offer a choice of assignments, so they have some ability to kind of be the masters of their own fate. Also, there's a major lab in this class, and there's something on our campus called the First Year Research Experience, which actually began in this class. Students work in groups of 4, so again, I'm putting together students kind of randomly. They don't know each other. And then after I do this, I sometimes see them at Tim Hortons having coffee, the 4 of them. I don't think I've put together any marriages yet, but I do see that the students actually get to know each other. They get to research a project on a specific animal topic that they get to choose. And the whole purpose of this is to teach them scientific literacy skills, science writing, data analysis. And so what I try and do is link those kind of basic things to their interest in animals. And I let them know that by learning these skills, that's going to improve their performance on every course that they take. This is the project. And so, yeah, the thing is worth a lot of marks, but it comes in small chunks. So they hand in, say, an introduction worth 5%. They get feedback from either myself or a TA. They rewrite it, hand it back in. And so they, as they go along, they have these small assignments that they can probably do in a couple of hours in the lab, and they get to do it twice. And so, yeah, it looks like it's a lot, but because it's in small chunks, it makes it more manageable. This is what the labs look like. Of course, there's a girl sitting there looking at her phone, but I don't think you can get around that. Basically, for the 2-hour lab period, these students sit in these tables and they work together on their projects. There's 3 TAs and myself in a class of about 40. So they get a lot of hands-on feedback on what they're doing. And at the end, we have a big poster session. There's probably 20, 30 posters in my class. Our faculty from my department all show up and they're the ones who mark these things, not myself. And so they get an opportunity to meet the rest of the faculty and kind of get the impression that what they're doing is important because, well, heck, a lot of professors showed up. Okay, so this is one last thing that I want to talk about, and that's talking about mental health in class. I have a particular interest in this. I give a lot of different talks to student groups about mental health and academics. And the reason is I have my own challenges with mental health. I have ADHD. And so I go around, I tell them in my talks about what ADHD is. And in the first lecture in every class I have, I describe my challenges dealing with this. I also have bipolar disorder. And so through my academic career, I've had depression and mania both affect how I've done. And I tell them exactly how I experienced my academics, why it took me 7 years to get through my undergraduate. And so I was really surprised at how powerful this was, that a lot of students come up to me after I do this, and they're incredibly grateful because now they know they're not the only one. Professors have the same problems. And so what I tell them is a lot of them will, if they're having problems, go to student services and they might be prescribed a medication for depression. But what I really want to talk about to them is all of those other things that your mother told you to do that are the things that really support your student mental health. So diet, sleep's incredibly difficult for a lot of students, exercise. And one of the things I really hammer on is meditation, because that's one of the things that's very helpful to my own mental health. And so I have a meditation in every class I have. We know students zone out after about 25 minutes. And so I take a 3-minute break. I do a 3-minute meditation from an app I subscribe to called Headspace. And I tried this and I thought, you know, I don't know, this isn't working. This is a bit creepy. So I stopped doing it. And then the students came up and asked me if I would continue to do it. So this is very popular and I get a lot of positive comments on it. So student feedback. So I do ask a lot of questions. I have a lot of surveys for them to do because I'm doing some research in this area. So what's beneficial? Making a point of getting to know them because, you know, in a class of 300 in a first-year biology class, maybe not going to happen. Allow me to reconnect with myself, focus on the now. This was the least stressful science lab I've ever had, I think because they knew what they were expected to do and they were allowed to improve it. And classroom discussions to see all the different points of view that these different students have. Of course, suggestions for improvement. You can't make everybody happy. So even though I tried to make this non-stressful, the last comment there is I have yet to learn anything and I find this class extremely stressful. Make us write real midterms rather than essays. You know, it's really easy to write a multiple choice midterm. Doesn't take nearly as much work as having to sit down and actually do some writing and then potentially rewriting. So, you know, nothing works for everybody. So you have to accept that. Last thing, teaching during COVID-19. This basically threw a monkey wrench in everything I was trying to do, because try and, you know, get that sense of belonging going when this is a class, there's 200 people online and those are the only students I can see. So it's very difficult for me. I feel a bit isolated, and I know it's really difficult for them. I have students in BC. I have students in China, Middle East. They've never been on campus. So how do you feel like you belong to the University of Saskatchewan? So this is a whole new challenge, and hopefully I never have this challenge again and we're all back in the classroom. Anyway, that's a brief description of the things I do, and the good things, some of the challenges. So thanks very much.
Great, thanks very much, Murray. We just thought we'd end with a quote from a student in terms of, you know, just how they were feeling in their experience. And I think just to again come back to recognize that while this can take investment, particularly investment of time and thought at the start, I think once we get rolling with these practices, they become part and parcel of our practice and less time consuming. But at the start, it takes an investment. But these practices, of course, enable good mental health and good learning. These aren't mutually exclusive, and we're not adding on additional things necessarily that instructors have to do. If they do these things in terms of their teaching and learning practices, they will achieve both good learning and create environments that are conducive to good mental health. And it's also really important to remember that there's a cost to not doing these things. So we know there's definitely a better way. So just to wrap up, back to the session outcomes, we hope that we've been able to give you an experience that's allowed you to achieve these outcomes. And now we want to pass over to you to tell us what you think. So over to Chris, I think, to facilitate that part.
Yeah, thank you so much to all three of you. I was really engaged and mesmerized in the presentation, and thinking a lot about my past experiences on a campus in various roles, and how it's only once you walk in the shoes that you really sort of get a true appreciation of the dynamics of each, you know, each function. We have a few questions here, and I'll jump into them right away so that we can try to get to as many as possible within the time that we have. First one's from Julia, and she says, how do we go from suggesting teaching staff follow these practices to, quote, enforcing it and making sure students are actually receiving a consistent experience? So I'll give you guys a tricky one right off the bat.
Well, this is kind of my entire career, so I don't mind tackling this one. I think it's really challenging to think about enforcing or requiring. And I think we can all think of times when we've been made to do something. It doesn't usually work. It doesn't usually end very well. I know it certainly doesn't with my teenage children. So I think what we're definitely trying to do is firstly make the case. Like, why would this matter to a faculty member? What would they gain from actually doing this? What would their students gain? And being really clear on the rationale. And I think sometimes we jump to, you just need to do this, and we don't actually take the time to engage students and to engage faculty and instructors in understanding the rationale and the evidence behind it. And that was part of our reason for this approach, is having this project, you know, really listening to students, listening to faculty, and drawing that together with the research. And I think there's also elements of ensuring that not only we're looking at the individual level, but we are looking at the collective and the systemic. How do we create systems that remove barriers for faculty to do these things? How do we reward them when they are done? And if we have systems that don't reward them or constantly put up barriers, then no wonder we don't have a lot of buy-in up front. So we have to look at our systems. We have to look collectively at working to kind of change ideas and change practices, and then provide that support to individuals as well, in terms of skill development, in terms of ensuring that we're looking at kind of all of those pieces. So I think the research backs me up. In fact, I know the research backs me up that actually saying thou must do this, it doesn't work. It doesn't work in any sector. It doesn't work in higher education. It's far more about a dialogue and an engagement and a providing those supports, and then making sure the systems actually enable that to happen. So that would be my view.
Does anyone else wish to add or contribute to that?
Yeah, sure. Of course, like Nancy said, you can't make people do stuff, but I think there are a lot of instructors who are interested in making the classroom experience better. Some classes, if it's a 450 seat class, maybe you're not going to be able to build those relationships like you could in my class of 80. I don't know if every class needs to do that. What the 450 seat class could do is be more explicit about how to be successful and improve alignment between that assessment and the stuff that's being taught. So not every class can do the same thing, but I think a lot of instructors would be interested. The other thing is it improves my experience. I enjoy it a lot more too, because if you know the students who are sitting in front of you, that's a much nicer experience.
Yeah, I just add, I think the big thing for this project with me is actually just connecting the student services part and being that part of the conversation that not to be at effect, looking upstream at cause to say, but this is in everyone's interest, because actually what we heard is everyone's struggling, and we can see some of that in the evidence, the challenges that staff and faculty are having, particularly in this current context, but in general. So I think it needs to build a bridge between those two things and not be afraid of that conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you all for your answers. And I just want to remind everyone in the audience that it is 2 p.m. or just after 2 p.m. now. We're going to stay on for a few extra minutes to field a few more questions for anyone that is interested in staying. And for those of you that do have to go, this recording will be up and archived on our website. I'll jump in right to the next question. So this one involves a few rhetorical questions. Maybe some of you want to field your responses to these. So anonymous attendee said, the question of student resilience, are students, quote, weaker now? Have brains changed? Are we expecting more than we did 20 years ago? Are we just more aware of mental health? The person asking the question acknowledges that they're playing devil's advocate a bit. And they say, I think high expectations are critical for achievement and producing graduates that are ready for the workforce. Does anyone have any thoughts or comments on that?
I can start. I mean, this was kind of the big question that I actually talked to when I talked to the Rotary Club, which was to say, are students more psychologically fragile nowadays? So there's so many factors, but actually the evidence suggests no. That in so many ways there's actual strength and resilience. And again, I'm generalizing enormously, but there isn't specifically evidence. I think the way the world that many of the people have been raised in, the way they've been parented, I know what terrible mistakes I make as a parent of overprotection and all those kind of things. So I think some of that's the case. I think we need to prepare people for the challenge, but I don't think what we're saying is let's make it easy. I think we're saying just because our generation had a particular approach, it doesn't necessarily mean that was right. But I also don't think the stakes were quite as high. I didn't pay tuition fees, so how about that as lowering the stakes? So there's a number of different things. But I also think from my very privileged perspective, actually, there were still some challenges. And that's from my privileged perspective, because actually the institution was designed for people like me in mind. And there were pictures of people like me on the walls. And so I think it's very easy to say from a place of privilege, let's play devil's advocate. But I appreciate the questions, because it does say that generationally, we need to take people with us, and people tend to see it through the lens of what their own experience was like. So I'm 25 years out of date. Other people are much more out of date. And I think even senior leaders at the university often now look to their children's experience, and sometimes their children have been out of university. So I think the way we talk about it and what that experience looks like is hugely variable, but I think it's just to embrace and recognize the complexity without feeling that we actually have to make it easy. That's not what we're saying. We're saying you need to structure it in ways that actually take some thought. And if you're still doing photocopies of handouts from 25 years ago, and when the demographic sitting in the classroom, and indeed the subject matter, has actually moved on. So I think it's to challenge ourselves, not to make it easy, and that our students are not snowflakes sitting in the classroom. This kind of whole perception of that, it's just false and actually very harmful in that way.
Thank you
And
very much, Peter.
I might just add just very, very briefly,
Sure.
like I don't think any of the teaching and learning practices that we outlined in any way suggested a lowering of standards. All we were actually, basically what we're laying out is means to allow any student who's willing to put in the work, and the work has to come from the students to meet, the environment, to be able to succeed. And that's fundamentally what we're talking about. Not at all lowering standards, but yeah, so I'll just leave it at that.
I would actually say we're trying to raise standards. If I sit around with a bunch of my colleagues, they say, well, fourth year students can't write, and it's all their fault. Well, I think if somebody can't do something, then that's the problem. We didn't teach them how to do it. So I think that's where you start in first year and build through second and third year, is start teaching the skills that you think are lacking. And then your students actually are more competent, not less competent. And as far as students being, are we just more aware of mental health, or is mental health really suffering? It's suffering. Life today, all we talk about is productivity. You have to produce more, you have to work longer. Think about how much more knowledge there is in science. When I went to university in the early 80s, science, our knowledge is doubling every 7 years. And of course, as professors, we've kept up, and we want to make sure our students know everything that's happened in the last, since we got out of university. I think we probably need to figure out what's important and maybe pare back on trying to cover everything that we know.
Thank you very much for that. Another question, Nancy, maybe this one's specifically for you. The question is, are all professors required to take the in-section training through your teaching and learning programming? And it says, to follow that up, if professors are simply masters in their field and have no educational background in teaching, how do they learn to develop, create, and present courses that are best designed for learners?
Yeah, excellent question. No, we don't have any required training at the University of Saskatchewan. I spent a decade, apologies if you can hear my dog barking in the background. I spent a decade in working in higher education in England. And in fact, there, the teaching and learning development is very much premised, because of national regulations, that every single faculty member takes a full master's level qualification in teaching and learning as part of joining the university, for the very reason that that was pointed out in terms of there being disciplinary expertise, but not teaching expertise. Interestingly, the research, and I've done some of it over there, doesn't show that actually necessarily improves teaching and learning, because again, it comes back to, we absolutely have to support skill development. It's not just about supporting the individual, though. It's actually about changing a culture, because an individual can change their ideas and their approaches to practice, but they still go back into a department that has the same ideas. And that department, particularly in the Canadian context, is where their tenure is provided, where it's determined whether they get merit or not. So it's a much broader kind of approach that we have to take, rather than just at the individual. And I'm not suggesting that we don't do things to support the individual, but we also have to look at it more collectively. And the only other thing that I'd mention is that while we absolutely have to have those professional development opportunities, some of it is also setting up processes, systems, and opportunities for our faculty, particularly our new faculty, to reflect on their learning, to listen to student voices, to then be able to make adjustments as they go through experience. Because just like students, we can't sit our faculty in a room and tell them how to teach well and expect that they're going to be able to do it. So we have to take everything that we just talked about in terms of good teaching practice and apply that to the way that we work with faculty. So we need to think about connecting to what matters to them. We need to think about, helping to support that skill development through direct experience and opportunity to reflect and get feedback. And we need to set up those systems so that we've got that environment where they can come in and actually learn and grow.
That's a great answer. And there is sort of a connected question that asks, well, what are your recommendations for getting these fantastic ideas, so everything the three of you have shared, into the hands of instructors, excuse me, and encouraging ongoing improvements? Would you recommend things like, or have you tried departmental champions, case studies, newsletters? What's been most effective for you guys?
Yeah, I'd say in terms, sorry, I'll just start and then I'll pass over. So we've done a whole bunch of things, and I would say like we are still at the start, I think, of using student mental health as a lens through which to think about improvements in teaching practice. I'd say we're at the very beginning of that journey, but we've been thinking for decades about how to help support improvements in teaching practice in line with what we've talked about. I think that having the lens of student mental health as a reason why we do this, and importantly, because we know faculty are experiencing you know, in some cases their own stressors, of course, because of what they're being asked to do, and can relate to that increased pressure and that societal kind of context that Peter alluded to. But also they are seeing more students coming into classrooms that are experiencing these same issues. And so, you know, we need to be able to help them address that particular issue. And I think we're just at the point where we're starting to now use that as a means to have conversations about why this should matter to students, why this should matter to our university community, how do we respond? But we absolutely do kind of do multiple kind of, and again, layered approaches in terms of teaching and learning enhancement that start with providing skills development and professional development opportunities for individual faculty, but importantly, groups of faculty. Curriculum development is a great opportunity for us to go in and actually ask coaching questions to the experts in a subject area about how they're designing their program, what they're including. That in and of itself, focused around a very necessary ongoing activity, is something that can promote understanding and learning. We do newsletters, we do communications, we do have resources available on websites that speak to good practice. Again, consolidated summaries of research so that people can draw on it. I think really importantly, and this is my last point, is that whenever we talk about any kind of change in teaching practice, we have to absolutely keep in mind and at the fore the context and the disciplinary understandings that exist, and they're very diverse across our campus. So one particular approach isn't going to work everywhere, certainly isn't going to work in every institution. It's not going to work in every department and with every kind of group of colleagues. So we need to be able to have our messaging be clear, consistent, but also when we're talking about what does that practice look like, it needs to be quite contextual. And so having those supports that help an exploration of what this looks like in my context and how does it fit with my understandings of what I'm trying to help my students achieve, my understandings and assumptions about learning, that has to be part of the conversation. Otherwise, we're going to miss the mark in terms of helping students or helping our colleagues support their students.
I guess I would just add that it's all about connection. It's all about relationships. It's all about trust. And meeting people where they're at and actually being curious. Some of our greatest champions are people who we've helped with their own challenges with students. And I think it's leveraging those things to talk about things being better. You know, let's take 3 steps back and let's look at how things could have been different. And I mean that in some really critically challenging situations, including the death by suicide of a student. And I think people do want to do better. I think it's just making it realistic for them as to what better looks like. But I think that meeting people where they're at on every front and not pointing fingers and saying that you're getting this wrong, because I think that nobody tries on purpose to get it wrong. Some of the culture within, you know, academic environments is challenging around this idea of we're all invulnerable, we have to be bulletproof. And just to be able to take that step into vulnerability. And I always appreciate Murray sharing, because it's so crucial to actually have people in positions of authority share. And when we started all this work around the wellness strategy, little did I know that I would end up with my own mental health diagnosis and a psychiatrist telling me that I was officially mentally ill. And that was a real revelation for me, but part of my own journey through doing this work. And it made so much sense of actually what I cared about and what I was doing. And I'm not actually stigmatized at all. I'm not ashamed to say that. because actually some of that, to Murray's comment, is part of the superpower. It's why I can do what I can do. It's where the strategy and those sort of connections come from. And so I think it's partly about being able to be real, particularly at senior levels, to say this is what's going on. And it's not an excuse. There's reasons, and that's different. That's like saying to a student from a minority background, but it's just an excuse. It's not an excuse, it's a reason. And if we're going to continue to increase accessibility, as we should, particularly in Canada, because that's who we are, you know, as a country as well. But that's a journey too. It's not an excuse. There's reasons, and we need to understand those things. And I saw a comment, that question about mental health as an excuse. But then often people need to educate themselves. And I needed to educate myself for my own context. And so I think that it comes back to relationships every time.
Thanks to both of you for providing an answer there. I'd love to have time to field some more questions, but we're right up against 2:15 now. So I was just going to say, and I don't know if it's possible to, I know you had your email addresses up on the last slide there, but for anyone who does wish to follow up with the three of you, it is indeed possible, and I know you've put it up there. Is there any last final words any of you want to say in that regard, or on any other notes?
No, I think we'd just love to hear from people. We're just our names with a dot in the middle at USASK.ca. I think we'd love to hear from people. We want to have this as part of a national conversation. We really appreciate the invitation, Chris, and all your work in supporting this conversation, the work that you guys do, the work that's happening across Canada. I think we're just so appreciative of the generosity of other people to share, and part of our own commitment around the Okanagan Charter was to do exactly this kind of thing. You know, we're not hiding our homework. This is on display. If we can work with other people, we really want that to be a part of the work too.
Yeah, and I would just echo that and say we're still learning as we go, and we've got a lot to learn from other people. We'd love to connect and have conversation and learn from each other. So
yeah, and I second that as well. It's yeah, the only way to have change is to, you know, talk about what people are doing, and hopefully, you know, start that seed growing.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you, all three of you, genuinely, for the time and effort and the planning we spend putting into this session. And thanks to all the people who are still in on the call. If you're still there and you think, hey, I'd love to have more of a focus continuing on this topic through our webinar series, through some of the content we're producing, feel free to reach out to us anytime. I'm always looking for next iterations to continue on with this work, so thank you.